I just know. I know for a fact that I'm fighting an uphill battle with this review. I know that. But all I'm asking is that you hear me out. That's all I'm asking. Just pay me that kindness, please. I'm releasing this on International Women's Day too, so really just setting myself up for greatness here, aren't I? Hey everyone, I'm Ben, your underground conductor, and welcome to Underground Cinema. Now, during my last series of videos, I spent a lot of time celebrating black culture and black filmmaking because February is Black History Month. But February is now behind us, and as a result, I'm moving into a new series of videos that I'm actually really excited about. Many of you may not be familiar with this, but March is actually Women's History Month, if you could believe it. And I figured, what better way to start off Women's History Month than talking about one of my favorite female-led action movies, Sucker Punch, directed by Zack Snyder. Off to a real strong start, aren't we? Now, Zack Snyder is a very interesting filmmaker in the modern landscape of Hollywood. He is also a very polarizing filmmaker. Not polarizing in the sense that he's controversial, although some of his films are, but polarizing in the sense that people have very strong disagreements about the quality of his work. On the one side, it seems like you have one group of people that uncritically praise anything that he puts out, seeing him as a visionary filmmaker who has mastered the art of cinema. While on the other hand, you have another group of people who despise his films and his style of filmmaking, believing him to be a shallow filmmaker who puts style over substance. Now, I'll be honest about my bias here. I fall more into the former camp than the latter. Zack Snyder is actually one of my favorite filmmakers. I've seen literally all of his feature films, from Dawn of the Dead, to Legend of the Guardians, The Owls of Ga'Hoole, movie that he actually directed, look it up, to the Snyder Cut. And while I certainly don't love all of Zack Snyder's films, Rebel Moon Part 2. Oh, that was weird. Something I do love is his filmmaking style. The way he's able to direct the shots in his films are just so artful. It often feels like every single frame of one of his films is like an illustrated painting that's oozing with meaning. And putting his visual flair aside, it's so interesting to see the way he interprets certain stories and then chooses to execute them. Like, I genuinely feel like so many of his movies are just teeming with purpose and commentary that's brewing right under the surface. And sometimes it's so far under the surface that most people either don't see it or refuse to see it. It's honestly just so interesting not only watching his films, but hearing so many people's commentary on his films. Because it honestly feels like Zack Snyder is one of the most misunderstood filmmakers in the modern cinema landscape. Like, seriously, I feel like the way people misinterpret Zack Snyder's films is in a similar vein to how people misinterpret Paul Verhoeven's films. Because, obviously, most of Paul Verhoeven's films are satires on fascism, and for some reason, most people just refuse to acknowledge that. It's really weird. Bottom line, though, Zack Snyder is one of my favorite filmmakers, and Sucker Punch is the film that set that reality in stone for me. Like, genuinely. Not only do I think Sucker Punch is a good movie, I actually think it's Zack Snyder's best movie. And yes, I am including both 300 and Watchmen. Like, genuinely, I think that Sucker Punch is great. And it's so interesting because it feels like I'm the odd man out on that. Like, I often make jokes in my personal life that I'm like only one of 5 people in the world who likes Sucker Punch. And sometimes it really feels like that's true, because I feel like I've only met like 3 or 4 other people who like this movie. Pretty much everyone else I talk to, whether they're critical about film or not, if they've seen Sucker Punch, they do not like it. And I honestly think that everyone has got it wrong on this. And I know that this is a bold thing to say, I know that this is a hot take, but I honestly feel like everyone has got this film wrong. Legitimately. And I know that I'm not only standing up to the majority of people on this, but I'm also standing up to some of the greats in the film world. Like, famous film critic Roger Ebert was still alive when this movie came out, and he thought it sucked. Quentin Tarantino, who is undoubtedly one of the greatest filmmakers of the modern age, called Sucker Punch one of the worst movies of 2011. I know I'm standing up to a lot of people on this. but I honestly think that Sucker Punch is not only a technically well-made film, but that's also a very emotionally provocative film that does so many interesting things in terms of both the art of filmmaking as well as the way we perceive liberation and action. But I've given a long enough preamble here, so what is Sucker Punch about? Well, we start our film at the beginning of a montage. We see the camera close in on our main character, Baby Doll, played by Emily Browning. And this montage sequence serves to set up the film's events and conflict perfectly. As within the span of less than 5 minutes, we perfectly understand that Baby Doll's mother has died, that her stepfather is a piece of garbage, and that she and her sister are now in danger. The film perfectly communicates these aspects of the plot to you visually, without any dialogue whatsoever. It's astonishing. Not only that, but in addition to the montage visually serving as setup for the film, we also get an accompanying narration and a cover song, both of which serve to set the mood and foreshadow events in the film. The narration we get suggests the existence of guardian angels, and how guardian angels often come from within us. And the cover song is a more somber version of Sweet Dreams by the Eurythmics, the cover being sung by the star of the movie, Emily Browning. Which is a side note that I actually wanted to bring up, being that the soundtrack for this film is amazing. I think pretty much all the songs in the soundtrack are covers of more famous songs, but it's so interesting because the covers are almost exclusively done by the film's cast. So you have an extra layer of integration into the story, because not only are the song selections appropriate for the film that you're watching, but they fit into the world perfectly because they're being sung by the actors in the film. It's a very specific production decision that feels like it almost blends together the concepts of diegetic and non-diegetic music. You have the best of both worlds in that scenario. Side note, I think the fact that the first song used in the film is a rendition of Sweet Dreams is actually incredibly appropriate thematically, considering that the song's lyrics contain several references to both use and abuse, which, as you find out later in this film, is incredibly relevant. In any case, though, near the end of the opening montage, the stepfather is enraged because he finds out that his now dead wife has left everything to her 2 daughters. So he seeks to solve the problem. He locks Baby Doll in her room, and then he starts going after the other sister. Baby Doll escapes from her room, and then she holds him at gunpoint. She fires the gun, but then she goes into the closet and finds that her sister is dead. Now, something I find interesting in this film is that it's never made explicit who kills the sister. I mean, they say near the end of the movie that Baby Doll killed her sister by mistake, which is entirely possible because we see the bullet ricochet when she shoots the gun. But it could also be the case that the stepfather actually killed her and then pinned it on Baby Doll. There's a nice piece of ambiguity in this scenario that can completely change the context of how you look at the character of Baby Doll depending on how you read it, and it's really interesting in terms of contextualizing this film. Anyway, as the montage ends and Baby Doll's sister dies, Baby Doll finds herself taken to a mental institution. When she gets there with the stepfather ends up making a deal with one of the orderlies, played by Oscar Isaac, bribing him with $2,000 to get her lobotomized, because this film takes place in the 60s, and you were still able to lobotomize people back then. Although, while we're on the topic, I would also like to point out how interesting it is that, despite being set in the 60s, Sucker Punch kind of feels like it could be set in any era. Like, the movie has kind of a timeless quality to it. And that quality is definitely reinforced by both the anachronistic music choices in the soundtrack, as well as the other fantastical elements regarding the action that you see later in this film. Anyway, Oscar Isaac accepts the deal and tells the stepfather that there will be a lobotomist there in 5 days. While this deal is being brokered, however, we see Baby Doll in the foreground, sort of disassociating herself from the situation that she's in. And her disassociation is communicated visually through the cinematography, as during this brokered transaction you actually see a split diopter shot between the stepfather and Oscar Isaac's character Blue, both talking over the fate of Baby Doll over each of her shoulders. Meanwhile, Baby Doll herself is completely focused on what's in front of her, being several other female inmates who are acting out their trauma on a stage. And we also hear dialogue in this scene from the character of Dr. Vera Gorski, telling the girls that if they can visualize a fantasy world for themselves as a therapeutic device, that world can become as real as their pain is. Baby Doll not only listens to this advice and internalizes it, but she also observes the scene in front of her as it feels very reminiscent of the scene that she just experienced. And the girl acting the scene out is one of the other main characters in the film, Sweet Pea. And as Baby Doll's eyes meet Sweet Pea's, we immediately understand the connection that these two characters will share later in the film. Anyway, Baby Doll is admitted into the institution. She's taken throughout the facility, spots the various totems that she could use for her escape later, and that's when the film transitions into its first layer of fantasy, as the institution that Baby Doll's in suddenly becomes a brothel, and the scene of Baby Doll getting lobotomized is substituted in fantasy with Sweet Pea, as she's complaining about the nonsensical nature of the scene that she's being asked to act out. From this point forth, it appears that the film is taking place in sort of this fantasy-adjacent world that Baby Doll has set up to sort of contextualize the situation that she's in. In reality, she's sitting in a mental institution waiting to get a lobotomy, but in her mind, the way she sees it is that she's basically been pimped out by her stepfather, and that if she doesn't escape within the week, she'll be taken by a high roller and taken advantage of. Now, most of the film takes place not only in one, but two layers of a fantasy world, which I will get into a bit later. But something I find so interesting is how grounded in fantasy this particular film is compared to Zack Snyder's other films. Because with so many of Zack Snyder's other films, it feels like they're being told through an objectivist lens. Now, for those of you who do not know, objectivism is an economic and moral philosophy that was initially proposed by the Russian-American novelist Ayn Rand. Now, I'll be completely honest up front. I'm not an expert in the writings of Ayn Rand, nor the philosophy of objectivism. I actually spent most of my college career independently studying the works of Jean-Paul Sartre. That being said, based on my limited understanding of the philosophy, objectivism basically suggests three central ideas. Idea number one being that selfishness, defined as maintaining a rational self-interest in one's own pursuit of happiness, is the highest possible virtue that any human being can achieve. Idea number two being that the only reality that can possibly exist is an objective and observable reality. And idea number three, that all individuals should be free to pursue their own selfish happiness without having their exceptional nature stifled by society. Now, when you look at these ideas, it really feels like a lot of Zack Snyder's films fall into the objectivist camp. Not only that, but Zack Snyder himself has admitted that his favorite book is The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. He's been wanting to adapt that book into film his entire career, and while he was working at Warner Brothers, he spent over a decade trying to convince them to let him adapt it. Now, I'm not sitting here claiming that Zack Snyder identifies as an objectivist. To my knowledge, he's never made such a claim. He himself has said definitively that the reason that he likes The Fountainhead so much is because he sees the story of the architect in that book as analogous for filmmaking and the struggles of an auteur against the studio system. And he also doesn't appear to be a fan of Ayn Rand's other works, like Atlas Shrugged, for instance. But I think that the fact that The Fountainhead is his favorite book, and that he's resonated so much with it, has probably had an unintentional influence on his style as an artist and a filmmaker. Because when you watch so many of his films, like 300, or Watchmen, or Man of Steel, those are all stories about exceptional people who are struggling against society and trying to prove that they have a right to exist in the exceptional way that they do exist. That being said, though, Sucker Punch in a lot of ways feels like the exception to that trend of his films. Because not only does the film focus heavily on the oppression of individuals, but it also takes place overtly in a fantasy world as opposed to objective reality. So it feels definitively like a departure from his other works. Not only that, but Sucker Punch was the first film Zack Snyder made as an original concept. Every film that he made beforehand, and most of the films that he made after, were all adaptations of other people's work. And to this day, the only other film that he's made that is definitively an original idea and not adapted from something else is Army of the Dead, which is interesting. In any case, back to the plot of Sucker Punch. Baby Doll gets introduced around by this character named Rocket, and Rocket introduces Baby Doll to the other central female characters of the film, Amber, Blondie, and Rocket's sister Sweet Pea, who Baby Doll shared a connection with earlier in the film. The girls then begin bonding over the terrible situation that they're in, and then we get our first dance sequence with Baby Doll. And this is where the film begins to get really interesting. Because as Baby begins dancing for the characters in the film, we, the audience, get to see what's going on deeper in her mind. As, from her perspective, we get this gorgeous change of setting to like a dojo. In the dojo, she meets a wise man, played by Scott Glenn, who famously played the character of Stick in the Netflix Daredevil series. He also has the best line in this movie.
Remember, ladies, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything.
Anyway, the wise man gives Baby Doll some weapons and tells her that if she wants to escape, then she'll need 5 tools. A map, a key, a knife, fire, and one final mystery item. The wise man then leaves Baby Doll to fight some giant demon samurai, which is epic. As Baby Doll defeats the samurai, we pivot back to the first layer of the fantasy, as we see that everyone in the room that she was dancing in was completely entranced by her performance. Now, we never actually get to see Baby Doll really dance in this film, but the way it's described to us by the other characters is that apparently it's very raw and unstructured, but also very titillating. Apparently it features a lot of gyrating and moaning. And the film choosing to deliberately not show us her dancing, and rather substituting her dance scenes for action sequences, is such an ingenious way of communicating to the audience that to Baby Doll, as a character, that this isn't just an escape plan, it's a battle for survival. After this first fantasy battle sequence, Baby Doll convinces the other 4 girls to escape with her by helping her collect the items that she was told about by the wise man. The film then delivers us 3 more battle sequences, each battle sequence being accompanied with her dancing to distract people around her, while the girls collect the items that she needs. The first battle sequence is the girls fighting against zombie Nazis as they're trying to get the map to the facility. The second battle sequence is the girls fighting against orcs and a dragon to get the lighter from the mayor who's visiting the girls. And the third battle sequence is the girls fighting against robots on a train to retrieve a knife from the cook. All 3 of these battle sequences are amazingly directed and visual eye candy. However, it's not all fun and games, as when you get to the last battle sequence, you see that the character of Rocket dies. And the reason she dies in that fantasy battle sequence is because in real life she was stabbed to death by the cook. At this point, the girls' plan has become kind of derailed, and throughout the course of their plan, the main orderly, Blue, who is the stand-in for the pimp in this story, has noticed that certain things aren't the way they seem to be. We then get to the final night, where the high roller, the lobotomist, shows up for Baby Doll. And Blue, in this moment, reasserts his authority by killing Amber, killing Blondie, and then threatening Baby Doll. Fortunately, Baby Doll is able to stab Blue and escape. She runs to get Sweet Pea, who's been locked in a closet. Then they set a fire as a diversion to escape. But when they get outside, they see that there's too many men for them to slip by unnoticed. So Baby Doll, in that moment, realizes this story's never been about me, it's been about you. And she chooses to distract the men, that way Sweet Pea can escape. And this sacrifice from Baby Doll's character is so selfless and thematically relevant to the film. Because at this point in the film, Rocket, which is Sweet Pea's sister, has died. And that event had an effect on Baby Doll because it made it reflect back to her own sister dying. So the way Baby Doll looks at it, she sees it as, okay, 2 sisters have already died because of me. 2 more girls who were following me also died because of me. I need to sacrifice myself so at least one of us can get away. Baby Doll then takes a sucker punch, which is the name of the movie, which allows Sweet Pea the opportunity to escape to a better life. Meanwhile, Baby Doll eventually suffers the lobotomy that she was promised. It's such a somber and tragic set of circumstances, but it's not all bad. Because even though Baby Doll as a character has had her brain scrambled at this point, her character has already long disassociated herself with this reality. And at the end of the film, when Oscar Isaac's character Blue is trying to enforce his own desires over Baby Doll, he finds himself not being able to become satisfied with the arrangement because she's not there anymore. She's gone. And as Blue gets taken away by the police, and you see the camera pan around to finally reveal Baby Doll's face, she just has a blank look on her face. Because even though she's not there anymore, it's clear that her character is satisfied that she not only helped another girl to escape, but in a way, she has escaped from this reality. And yeah, that's the story of Sucker Punch. I think that this film is genuinely great. Like I said, I think everyone has got it wrong about this movie. The film is well acted, well directed, creative, And on top of all that, it still retains the Zack Snyder visual flair. Like, I've heard the criticisms, but I honestly don't understand why so many people think that this movie is bad. Like with so many other films that I've reviewed on this channel, like Bad Taste, Robot Jocks, Captain America 1990, I can understand why people don't like them. They're smaller productions, they're less professional, they're lower budget, they tend to be amateurish, they don't have the same shine and polish that a higher budget film does. So people often look at the sometimes poor filmmaking decisions in these B-movies and write them off as bad. And personally, I feel like that's a very shallow way to criticize a film, as it often completely ignores what the film's purpose is, what it sets out to do, and how well it achieves its goals. But I can understand, at least, why people disregard those films. With Sucker Punch, though, I think everyone has just got it wrong. Like, reading through the critiques of Sucker Punch, so many people feel like this is just a shallow exploitation film, something that's in the same vein as, like, Caged Fury from 1990, which is a nasty film, by the way. But I think classifying Sucker Punch like that completely ignores what the film is trying to do. What the film is doing is highlighting the oppression of women at the hands of monstrous men, and how these women can use their sexuality as an advantage to help themselves escape. Like I said, Baby Doll's dancing in this movie is defined as titillating, gyrating, moaning. She's distracting men with her sexuality, while in her mind she is fighting for dear life. That's not shallow, that's genius. And by framing the fantasy action sequences as the way the girls view themselves, you get to have your cake and eat it too. Because with so many other female-led action movies, like Disney's Mulan for instance... Just for clarification, I am in fact talking about the live-action Mulan. Not the animated one, which is perfect. The live-action one, which was awful. They portray an overtly unrealistic version of female action. You know, it's basically the Mary Sue dilemma that no one would shut up about back in the 2010s. But with Sucker Punch, you as the viewer understand that the action sequences that you're watching are fake. They're fantasies. But the fantasies still serve the ultimate purpose of helping the girls in their escape plan. They're married to the narrative in such a way that they don't feel pointless even though they're completely fabricated. And a lot of people also accuse this movie of being misogynistic in the way that it objectifies women's bodies. And to those people I would say, have you watched any Zack Snyder movie? The man is obsessed with the human form. And if you're going to accuse Sucker Punch of being sexist in the way it objectifies women's bodies, look at 300. Just guys with washboard abs chucking spears at each other. Like, you're allowed not to like it, but pointing that out as a flaw with the film is completely ignoring the tendencies of this filmmaker. And if you want any more evidence of how this film criticizes female oppression at the hands of men, they cast John Hamm as the lobotomist in this film. The same John Hamm who played Don Draper in Mad Men, a series that famously centered around that concept. Side note, John Hamm is also really good in this film. He has a dedicated scene in the extended cut of the movie where he's really able to flex his acting muscles. And the scene itself is quite interesting in its intent, but I can also see why they took it out of the theatrical version. Still, John Hamm's always a good choice. And Oscar Isaac is also really goddamn good in this movie, seamlessly portraying two separate versions of the same character. On the one hand, you have Blue, the corrupt orderly, and on the other hand, you have Blue, the sleazy pimp. And Oscar Isaac carries both roles really well. Like most of the actors in this movie, he's doing a great job. And going back for a moment, regarding the critiques of this film being shallow, people not only complain about the plot being shallow, but people also complain about the characters not being fleshed out well. And this is true for a couple characters, I would say. Like, I would have liked to see more from the characters of Amber and Blondie, but Sweet Pea, Rocket, and Baby Doll are all perfectly developed in this story. You understand who each of these characters are, how they ended up here, and what motivates them. Rocket is a nonconformist who's just looking for a new adventure constantly. Sweet Pea is the cautious older sister who's just making sure that her little sister isn't going to kill herself. And Baby Doll, we understand who Baby Doll is from the very beginning of the movie, when the camera pans in on her stage, coming in from the fourth wall, as we see she's dealing with a lot of emotional issues regarding, like, her dick of a stepfather and her mother's death. Like, we understand who these characters are. And even if you feel like the writing isn't up to snuff, the film also visually conveys exactly who these people are and what they want. And that also leads into the cinematography for this film, which is spectacular. Like, I feel like it goes without saying, but most of Zack Snyder's films are just visual eye candy. And you can attribute a lot of that in this film to Larry Fong, who did the cinematography for this, 300, Watchmen, and Batman vs. Superman. He knows what Zack Snyder's looking for in a film, and he knows how to perfectly execute Zack Snyder's visions. And the depth of field that he can create with the camera is so visually striking that it nearly defies comprehension or description. And this is exemplified so well in so many different scenes that also complement the characters. Like, there's an amazing mirror shot in the film where it pans from the reflection side to the real world side. And while I was watching the film, I thought to myself, that's an amazing effect. And then I looked into it. Apparently that effect was practically done. What they did is that when they were on the reflection side, they had body doubles standing in for the actresses looking into the mirror, and they just had the body doubles mimic the actors' movements perfectly in the mirror. Then when the camera spins around, they slot real mirrors into the frame, and you actually capture the real reflections of these characters as they're talking to each other. It's amazing. And this particular scene also illustrates the change of heart that the character of Sweet Pea has when Rocket is telling Sweet Pea about how Baby Doll saved her from the cook. Like, there's no question about it. This film is great. It's not perfect, though. Like I said, I feel like a lot of the criticisms that are made against this film aren't really legitimate. I feel like the claims of it being misogynistic are more personal taste than anything, and I think the accusations of it being shallow are just ignoring the actual context of the film. But I think you can make a legitimate critique that the film is a bit emotionally manipulative. Like, the initial framing of this film is women trying to escape from an asylum. Inherently, from the impetus of the setup, you're framing the characters that we're following as underdogs. Which is fine. It's a quick and easy way to get the audience on the side of these characters. But throughout the film, they employ basically every storytelling technique you can think of to constantly remind the viewer that these are women in peril. Not people in peril. Specifically women in peril. And that's a very important distinction to make because, as anyone could tell you, women are generally perceived to be more innocent and trustworthy and therefore are more vulnerable to negative forces in the world. This is true not only in real life but also in fiction. This concept is actually the basis behind the femme fatale trope, in the sense that you have a woman that seems to be like the victim of a terrible situation, but she ends up flipping it on a gullible man that she's manipulating. Like, it's really simple narrative shorthand. The quickest way to get the audience invested in the events is to either put a woman in danger or a child in danger. And that is kind of reflected on the costume design of the main character. I think Emily Browning is great in this movie, and I think the costume design for her perfectly conveys who her character is supposed to be. But, you know, the name Baby Doll, that wasn't chosen for no reason. She looks like a baby doll. She's wearing like a schoolgirl dress. She has blushed up cheeks and pigtails. Like, she looks like a little girl. That's intentional. And that's done deliberately to get us to feel more sympathy for her. The film basically beats you over the head every 5 minutes to remind you, hey, you should feel sorry for these people. Hey, you should feel sorry for these people. And I do. But you don't have to keep reminding me of that. Like I said, I love this movie. I think it's genuinely good. But I think those particular storytelling decisions are intentionally manipulative in a way they don't have to be. Like, if you take the setup here and you compare it to a different film, like Mad Max Fury Road, for instance, you know, it's a film about 5 women who are trying to escape from an evil man who insists that they are his property. But with Mad Max Fury Road, the 5 women that we're following being Toast, Cheeto, Capable, the Dag, and the Splendid Angarad, the film doesn't have to constantly remind us that they're women in peril. We understand that from the visual cues that the film gives us, like the fact that a couple of them are pregnant, or the fact that they're wearing chastity belts with teeth in them. Like, we don't have to constantly be told that it'd be terrible if they went back to Immortan Joe. We just know that. So, in that sense, Sucker Punch could have been more subtle, but still, I don't think that's enough to derail this film. This film is just overall structured really well. And I think the thing that really hammers that home is the fact that they trade guardian angels throughout the film. Like I said, at the beginning, there's a narration suggesting that guardian angels come from within you and they come from places you wouldn't expect. Throughout the film, you're under the impression that the wise man is the guardian angel for Baby Doll. But by the end, Baby Doll realizes that she was the guardian angel for Sweet Pea. She trades places and lets Sweet Pea escape. And that leads to the ultimate tragedy of this film, and makes you just really appreciate the sacrifices that Baby Doll had to make in order to set things right. In any case, like I said before, you are allowed not to like this movie. Obviously, at the end of the day, art is subjective, but if you were willing to listen to my unhinged opinions on this movie for this long, then I hope that at least one thing I said managed to get you to think about this movie just a little differently. So yeah, that was my review of Sucker Punch. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. You can also follow me on Instagram or Letterboxd if you want to hear more of my film takes. And I will see you later.